They handed me a pen, gold, engraved, elegant. On the table was a contract. 6 pages, titled in bold, prenuptial agreement. And the sentence that sliced through the silence, we just want to make sure you leave with nothing. Her voice was sweet, sugar-laced with steel. His mother, Clarice. Jordan sat beside me, silent, still. The man I had planned to marry. The one who once whispered dreams into my ear now watched me be gutted. Quiet. I smiled. Not because I was okay, not because I agreed, but because I knew something they didn't. That while they saw me as a placeholder, a social climb, a narrative to polish for their legacy press kits, I had just inherited $29 million. Quiet money, old money, mine. I picked up the pen, turned it in my hand, then gently set it down. This wasn't the night I got humiliated. It was the night they underestimated the wrong woman. And I didn't have to raise my voice to make that clear. Before the silence and betrayal, there was something real, or at least I believed it was. My name is Alara, and for most of my life, I thought love was something you earned by giving more of yourself. I didn't grow up with privilege, but I did grow up with purpose. My father fixed engines by day and read philosophy by night. My mother was soft-spoken but fierce when it came to defending the vulnerable at the public library where she worked. They taught me that integrity outlasts inheritance. I carried those lessons into my career. By the time I met Jordan, I had spent 6 years building a consultancy that helped community organizations manage their finances, restructure debt, and compete for large-scale grants. I was tired, fulfilled, and not particularly looking for love. He arrived in the form of a quiet man with a sharp mind, soft laugh, and eyes that didn't flinch when I talked about economic injustice over coffee. We met at a panel discussion about financial equity, and he stayed after to ask more questions. I noticed his curiosity before his charm. In those early days, Jordan was all in. He attended my workshops, quoted my research, bragged about me to his friends and family. He wasn't intimidated by my ambition. He seemed to revel in it. We hosted pop-up fundraisers together, organized joint pitch decks for nonprofits, and built this illusion of being equals, warriors on the same side. He called me his lighthouse. I believed him. The first time I visited his family's estate, I was overwhelmed but hopeful. Clarice, his mother, greeted me with the kind of hospitality that looked polished on the outside but hollow underneath. She gave compliments that echoed like evaluations and made suggestions like corrections. Still, I tried. I brought wine from a local vineyard. I memorized names and board affiliations. I laughed at jokes that weren't meant for me. I kept showing up even when I wasn't entirely welcomed in. And I began to change. Subtly, I shortened my natural hair to something more sleek, toned down my wardrobe, avoided certain topics at dinner, especially anything too political or too grassroots. I didn't realize I was slowly silencing myself. Jordan didn't ask me to, but he didn't stop me either. Yet I held on. I told myself love was about compromise, that blending two lives meant bending a little. And when he proposed, sunset, string lights, and a small jazz trio in the background, I said yes without hesitation. My friends cheered. My mother cried. Even Clarice gave a nod of approval, a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. We planned a future. Or rather, I planned it with the outlines they provided. His family took over the venue, the guest list, the vendors. Every time I asked about flowers or food, I was told it's taken care of. They weren't being generous, they were being territorial. But I didn't see it then. I thought this was what marrying into an old money family looked like, a different culture, one I just needed time to adjust to. And Jordan, he kept telling me, just let them have their way, babe. It's easier. So I did. I set aside my instincts. I ignored the unease. I made myself small in the name of something I thought was bigger than both of us, love. Back then, if you had asked me what I'd do for him, I might have said anything, and I would have meant it. But love built on silence isn't love. It's survival dressed as devotion. Looking back, I can trace the line between who I was and who I was becoming. A woman who kept receipts but forgot to keep boundaries. A woman who gave the benefit of the doubt one too many times. I knew how to fight for clients, for causes, for communities, but I never learned how to fight for myself within a relationship. And yet I loved him. I loved the version of him that made space for me, the one who listened, who laughed with me at midnight over spreadsheets and bad takeout. That version made the sacrifices feel worth it. So I stayed, even when the cracks began to show, even when his silence grew louder than any argument we never had, because I thought love meant staying even when you're shrinking. I didn't know yet that real love doesn't require you to disappear. But I was about to learn. It started slowly, like a room dimming one light bulb at a time, subtle enough to doubt your own eyes. The signs that I wasn't truly welcome, not as a guest, but as a fixture, came wrapped in politeness and brushed off with grace. The first time I noticed it was during a planning meeting for the engagement party. I offered to contribute ideas for the decor, something that reflected both our backgrounds. Clarice smiled, thin and practiced. "We've already chosen a theme," she said. "Timeless elegance. Simplicity works best in photographs." I nodded. My culture, my family traditions, none of it made the mood board. Later, when I asked Jordan about it, he shrugged. "She just wants everything to look right. It's not personal." That became a chorus I would hear again and again. At dinner with his extended family, conversations often drifted into a realm of private schools, exclusive foundations, and golf clubs with unspoken codes. When I brought up a recent grant I helped secure for a shelter, the table fell awkwardly silent. Clarice refilled her glass. "You're very passionate," she said, like it was a flaw. And then came the subtle exclusions, calls I wasn't copied on, meetings I wasn't invited to, plans made on behalf of the couple without my input. The wedding dress was chosen from a family atelier before I saw a single sketch. The caterer had already been booked through a legacy vendor. Every time I protested, Jordan kissed my forehead and said, "They mean well, just let them have this." I began to feel like a bystander in my own engagement. Once I was 10 minutes late to a family brunch because of a client emergency. Clarice greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Alara," she said, "in our family, punctuality is a form of respect." I opened my mouth to explain, but Jordan touched my hand under the table, signaling me to let it go. The most painful part wasn't the passive comments or decisions made without me, it was Jordan's silence, his unwillingness to defend me out loud. To his family, he was agreeable, accommodating. To me, he was apologetic in private but absent in public. One afternoon, I overheard Clarice on the phone. She's charming enough, but let's be honest, she's not really one of us. She saw me standing in the hallway and didn't flinch, just ended the call and walked past me like I was furniture. Even the house began to feel like it rejected me. Every surface, too pristine. Every photo, too curated. Jordan once offered to clear a drawer for me in the master suite. "Just one?" I asked. He blinked, as if surprised I'd want more. I told myself it was temporary, a phase, something that would shift after the wedding, but deep down I knew this wasn't hesitation, it was assimilation, and I was the one being asked to disappear. The closer the wedding got, the more I faded, until the woman I saw in the mirror looked less like a bride and more like an imposter wrapped in tulle. Still, I stayed, because I believed that love could soften legacy. Because I thought Jordan would speak up. Because I hadn't yet realized that silence, too, is a kind of cruelty. The holidays came and went with more photo ops than warmth. During a New Year's toast, Clarice raised her glass and said, "To legacies that last," eyes lingering on Jordan like I wasn't even there. I smiled for the camera, my hand resting lightly on his, and wondered if this was how women vanished. Smiling, quiet, obedient. Even my mother noticed. You okay, sweetheart? She asked during one of our rare phone calls. I told her I was just busy. She paused. Busy is fine. But don't let love cost you your voice. I brushed it off, but her words stayed. Each time I bent myself to fit their mold, I felt a little more hollowed out. And Jordan's silence, once gentle, once understanding, turned into something sharper. A form of consent to everything his family implied. The man who once called me brilliant now said, maybe you're overthinking it, more than he said, I love you. I stopped bringing up the things that mattered, stopped correcting mispronunciations of my last name, stopped dreaming out loud. Because when a house isn't built to include you, every step feels like trespassing. But what I didn't know then was that all these small humiliations were rehearsals for something far crueler. It was supposed to be a celebration. The envelope arrived 3 weeks before the wedding, thick, cream-colored, embossed with gold. No first names, just the Blake family. Formal, detached, an invitation to a private dinner in my honor. Jordan said it was tradition. One last welcome before you officially become part of the family. I dressed carefully that night. Soft navy, understated pearls, the kind of look Clarice called refined. When I arrived, the house gleamed like a showroom, too perfect. The butler took my coat and Clarice greeted me with air kisses and the smell of white lilies, which I hated but never mentioned. Dinner was served in a sunken dining room, 12 seats. Crystal glasses, everyone was already seated when I walked in. Jordan didn't stand. He just motioned to the seat beside him like a host guiding a guest. I smiled thinly and sat down. We ate duck confit and truffled risotto. Conversation floated, legacy investments, political connections, a cousin's upcoming wedding in Florence. I contributed where I could, careful not to sound too activist. Every time I tried to steer the topic toward nonprofit work or local impact, the room shifted, politely, strategically, back to their world. Then Clarice tapped her glass. I'd like to propose a toast, she said, rising with a practiced elegance, to family and to ensuring our family remains protected. She turned to the sideboard and retrieved a black velvet envelope, walked over, placed it directly in front of me. Just a small formality, she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I opened it slowly. Thick paper, sharp language. A prenuptial agreement, 6 pages, stating that all Blake family assets remain separate, no claims in the event of divorce, no access to family trusts, no shared property, no inheritance. Nothing. Jordan didn't move, didn't speak, didn't touch my hand. He watched. The same man who once said, "We're a team," now sat mute while his family codified my disposability. And then he slid something toward me, a pen, engraved, Lara and Jordan, always. He'd given it to me weeks ago, said it was a gift to mark our future. Now it sat beside a contract designed to erase mine. My breath caught, not from the shock, but from the clarity. This wasn't sudden. This was orchestrated. And worse, he knew. You might not have written the document, but he'd read it, endorsed it, allowed it to be handed to me like a gift wrapped in civility and acid. I looked at him, really looked. He was wearing the suit I bought him for his last keynote speech. A pocket square folded just right, and that familiar, apologetic smile, like a man too weak to choose sides. Ilara, Clarice said gently, we just want to make sure everything's clear in case things don't work out. In case? I echoed. Not personal, dear, just structure. It's how our family does things. I set the pen down. Don't speak. Didn't cry. Didn't give them the drama they were silently hoping for. My chair scraped against the floor like thunder in that pristine room. And I walked out, heel clicks echoing behind me like applause I didn't need. In the car, I didn't drive. I just sat there staring at the contracts. I wasn't sad. Not yet. I was stunned, not by their cruelty, but by his compliance. The man I loved didn't lose his voice. He gave it away. And somewhere in that quiet, my heart broke, not with noise, but with finality. I got home and dropped the velvet envelope on the kitchen counter like it might burn through the granite. The air in my apartment was still, lavender scented, soft. My world, my rules, but my mind couldn't settle. I didn't sleep. Instead, I opened my laptop, started searching. Emails, attachments, old PDFs, anything that had come from Clarice or the family office. At 2:47 a.m., I found it. Document titled Marital Merger Outline Q4 Strategy. My name, Ilara Ward, was on page 3. Slide after slide of positioning language, optics, metrics, underdog narrative potential, diversification of public image, media softening via multicultural engagement. They had drafted a PR rollout with me at the center, not a daughter-in-law, a brand. One note read, ensure compliance with contract to avoid entanglements. Entanglements. That's what they called me. Worse, the document had a timestamp. 7 months before I met Jordan. Sat back in my chair, cold sweat prickling down my back. They'd planned this. I was never the surprise, I was the strategy. And Jordan? He knew. There were email strings, his name copied, his replies brief. It sounds reasonable. Let's keep it clean. That night, the love story I believed in turned to data points and bulletproof clauses. The man who once told me, "You're the best thing that's ever happened to me," had forwarded my headshot to the PR team with the subject, "Use this one." Closed the laptop, stared at the ceiling, and for the first time since I left their house, I cried. Not because I lost him, but because I had given so much to someone who never planned to give anything back. This wasn't just a betrayal of love. It was the exploitation of my identity, my story, my integrity for their gain. By morning, I wasn't broken. I was sharpened. And they had just handed me everything I needed to dismantle their illusion. Made a cup of coffee, black and bitter, and called the one person I trusted more than anyone, Miss. I said, voice hoarse, I need your help. We're going to build a different kind of strategy, one that starts with the truth. Because if they wanted a merger, then it was time I rewrote the terms. On my terms. There's a special kind of grief that comes not from loss, but from realization. The kind that doesn't roar, but hums beneath your ribs. That's what I felt in the days that followed. I moved through my apartment like a ghost. The wedding binder still sat on my desk untouched. My dress still boxed, waited in the corner like an accusation. Jordan called 5 times the first day. I didn't answer. The sound of his name on my screen made my stomach clench. Miss came over the next evening. She didn't bring pity, just groceries, a charger, and silence. The good kind. The kind that says you're not alone, even when you don't have the words. Ilara, she said finally, you didn't walk into love. You walked into a campaign. I didn't cry, not in front of her, but that night, I lay on the floor of my bedroom, staring at the ceiling, hands gripping my chest like I could hold myself together physically if I just stayed still enough. My phone buzzed again, this time a message from Jordan. I didn't know they were going to do it that way. I don't want to embarrass anyone. That was the moment I realized something deeper than betrayal. I had been in love with a man who cared more about appearance than alignment. He didn't choose me. He chose comfort. In the silence that followed, I began to question everything, my judgment, my heart, my worth. Was I foolish? Did I miss the signs? Had I loved him more than I loved myself? My therapist once told me that trauma often arrives dressed as clarity. And clarity was cruel, because now I saw the cracks I had painted over. The moments I'd excused, the dinners I'd tolerated, the conversations I'd diluted to keep the peace. I had shrunk, and they had applauded my compliance. I scrolled through old photos, smiling, glowing, draped in dresses I no longer recognized. My captions were filled with words like grateful, blessed, journey. It wasn't fake, but it wasn't whole either. And then on the third night came the package. No return address, just a wax seal, my father's. Inside, a trust document, a letter, a series of notarized papers detailing his final wishes. He had named me the sole heir to land I didn't even know we still owned. Appraised value, $29 million. I sat on the floor, documents in hand, and for the first time in days, I felt something close to breath. He hadn't said I love you in his last letter. That wasn't his way. But he had written, if they try to shrink you, it's because they see what's coming. Those words were a match, and the spark reached something in me I thought had died. Not anger, not yet, but defiance. A quiet, necessary defiance that whispered, they don't get to write your story. And just like that, I knew. I wasn't done. I was just getting ready. That night, I didn't sleep again. But this time, it wasn't because of dread, it was because my mind was on fire. I opened every folder I had, every receipt, every invoice I'd ever sent to Jordan's team, every email I'd written on behalf of the Blake Foundation, even the ones they never acknowledged. I found the grant proposal I had ghostwritten for their biotech partnership, the one that secured them 7 figures in federal funding. They never credited me, but I kept the drafts. I made a list, a revenge list, a record of every time I had shown up, stood still, stayed kind while being diminished. It wasn't about getting even. It was about getting clear. And that clarity, it changed the air around me. My apartment still smelled like lavender and old paper, but it didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like mine. I took a shower, scrubbed my skin raw, washed my hair with my mother's old rose-scented oil. I looked at myself in the mirror, not for beauty, but for truth. My eyes were tired, but they were steady. There was still a storm ahead, but now I had an anchor. Myself. So I called my... You were right, I said. It wasn't love, it was a contract. And now? She asked. Now I write my own. I heard her exhale. You ready? Not yet, I said, but I will be. And that was enough. Because healing doesn't always look like strength. Sometimes it looks like survival with a plan. And I was building mine. Recovery doesn't come all at once. It arrives in fragments, in the clink of a spoon against porcelain, in the sound of your own breath returning to rhythm. The morning after I found the trust documents, I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by folders and memories. There were receipts for donations I had advised the Blake Foundation to reroute, memos I had written, PowerPoint decks I designed, used without credit, a lifetime of invisible labor for people who wanted me invisible. I wasn't just healing, I was preparing. Chris and I met the next afternoon in a quiet co-working space. She brought coffee, I brought the evidence. They don't just erase people, she said, flipping through the emails. They repurpose them. We made a plan, not for revenge, but for reclamation. The first step, create a legal firewall. I transferred my personal holdings into a protected trust, updated my will, and removed any reference to Blake partnerships in my professional biography. My lawyer reviewed the inheritance documents again. They were solid. Next, we drafted my version of a prenup, not because I still intended to marry Jordan, but because I wanted to show them I understood their game now, and I had rules of my own. Then came the brand. Quietly, discreetly, Miss helped me register a foundation under the name The Marin Initiative after my grandmother, the woman who raised me when my parents worked triple shifts. The mission was clear: empower women facing institutional erasure, financial, emotional, It wasn't about going public, not yet. It was about taking up space again. The act of rebuilding became sacred. I replaced the broken pen Clarice had offered me with my father's fountain pen. Still heavy, still gold, but now mine. I reached out to 3 of the nonprofits I had paused work with during my engagement. All of them said yes before I finished asking. I stopped checking for Jordan's messages, stopped wondering if he understood. It no longer mattered because I did, and for the first time in weeks, I slept through the night. The next morning, I wore a dark red blazer, slipped on my heels, and walked into a law firm across from City Hall. I had an appointment, not to file anything against the Blakes, but to formalize the Marine Initiative. I'd like it fully independent, I said. No family advisory board, no partner veto power, transparent, untouchable. The clerk smiled. Name of founder? Lara Ward. That name mines alone sounded like something I was finally ready to defend. And this time, no one would sign it away from me. Over the next week, I disappeared from the social circles that once demanded my constant performance and reappeared where it mattered, quietly, strategically. I visited an old mentor from graduate school, Professor Hale, someone who'd once told me reputation isn't what people say when you succeed, it's what survives when they try to bury you. I showed him the Blake PR deck, the one that turned me into a campaign. He read it, then looked up slowly. They thought you were their story, he said. Turns out you're the editor. Together, we mapped a press strategy, one that didn't scream scandal but centered on reclaiming voice. He connected me with a journalist at the Ledger, and I made one request. Don't soften it, just tell it straight. Meanwhile, Miss coordinated the technical back end of the Marin Initiative, staffing, legal filings, digital protection. We sourced testimonies from women who had similar stories. Some had been silenced, others were still fighting. We weren't just creating a foundation. We were building a mirror to show the world how many Hilaras had been made to vanish quietly. I started journaling again. At first, my hands shook, but the words came, and in those entries, I rediscovered a voice that had been forced into politeness, into palatability. Not anymore. One entry ended with, "They reduced me to optics. I will become reflection." Another, "I'm not a warning, I'm the consequence." Every day, I stood taller, not because the pain vanished, but because I had learned how to carry it like armor instead of weight. Then one morning, I got an email from a partner at a funding firm in DC. They had seen early whispers of my initiative. The subject line, "We believe in what you're building. When can we talk?" I stared at it for a full minute before replying, not because I doubted, but because for the first time, I understood the power of saying yes on my own terms. And that was real recovery. They thought I'd stay quiet, thought silence was submission, but I wasn't quiet, I was calibrating. I returned to the Blake estate on a rainy Sunday, 3 weeks after the dinner. This time, I didn't come as their future daughter-in-law. I came as a woman with her own pen, her own terms, and nothing to lose. Clarice greeted me at the door wearing the same silk blouse from the night of the betrayal. Jordan stood behind her, eyes guarded. His father lingered in the parlor, pretending to read. "I came to talk," I said simply. We moved to the same dining room. No duck, no wine, just distance. I opened my bag and placed a navy folder on the table. "A prenup," I said. "From me." Jordan blinked. "You're joking." I smiled and not. Inside was a contract I'd spent 10 days refining with legal counsel. Joint assets, shared profits, mutual transparency. Any prior agreement, including theirs, would be voided if this one was signed. It's a little tradition from my side," I added. "You sign this or we're done." Clarice scoffed. "You don't walk into our home making demands." "I'm not in your home," I corrected. "I'm in a building you own. My home is built on values, and this is your final invitation into it." Then I reached into my coat and placed my father's gold pen next to the folder. Jordan stared at it like it might explode. Clarice turned to Reginald. Say something. But Reginald was studying me now, quietly, strategically. I suggest, he said slowly, that we read the document. The silence that followed was heavy, but not with power, with shift. For the first time, I wasn't reacting. I was leading. Jordan flipped through the pages. His hands shook slightly. This voids the trust clauses, he asked. Yes, I said, and protects mine. Clarice's face flushed. You manipulated this entire thing. No, I said calmly. You did. I just documented it. And then I handed over the final envelope, copies of their PR deck, time-stamped, watermarked, and prepared for release. If you think I came here with threats, you're wrong. I came with receipts. Reginald picked up the pen. Sign it, Jordan. Jordan hesitated. And then he signed, one letter at a time. When it was done, I picked up the contract, folded it neatly, and slid it back into my bag. You once asked me to leave with nothing, I said to Clarice. Now I walk out with everything that matters. Dignity, truth, and a legacy I built myself. Then I stood and I left. This time, no heels clicking like applause, just thunder in the distance, the kind that warns of a storm that's already arrived. Outside the estate, Miss was waiting in a rental car, engine idling, playlist humming softly. Well, she asked. I held up the signed document. She didn't cheer, just nodded once. The kind of nod women give when they know the war is still on, but the first battle is ours. We drove straight to the notary's office, filed the contract, then uploaded a secure version to a shared drive with 3 lawyers on standby. The next step was media. We didn't need a scandal, just light. I scheduled a meeting with the journalist at the Ledger, brought the proposal deck, the emails, the contract they tried to hide. I didn't ask for sympathy, I asked for documentation. 2 days later, the story ran The Price of Silence, how one woman rewrote the rules. No sensationalism, just facts. And the internet did the rest. Within hours, I received emails from women across the country, executives, interns, community leaders. They weren't shocked. They were familiar. You made it public, thank you. Your story is mine, just with different names. You didn't flinch, I won't either. The Blake family went quiet, then panicked. A charity partner paused funding, a legacy sponsor pulled out. Clarice issued a statement full of vague regret and health concerns. Reginald disappeared from public view. And Jordan, he tried to reach out. An email, that's a voice memo. I didn't know how to stop it. I'm sorry, but I did. I replied with a single link to the Marin Initiative's public launch. Under it, a message, this is how we stop it. Then I blocked him, not out of spite, out of survival. I wasn't just closing a door. I was redesigning the house. And in it, there was no room left for apologies wrapped in privilege. Only purpose and a pen with my name on it. A week later, I was invited to speak at a women's leadership forum, one I used to attend in the back row. Now I stood at the podium, calm in a tailored navy suit. I didn't share everything, just enough. Enough to show that silence doesn't protect, it erases. Enough to remind every woman listening that contracts, like love, require consent and clarity. Afterward, a young intern approached me, nervous, hopeful. How did you know you were ready to fight back? She asked. I smiled. I wasn't, but I did it anyway. Because healing isn't a moment. It's a decision you make again and again. And that day I chose myself loudly. News spreads fast, but truth spreads louder. Within 48 hours of the article's release, the Blake family's reputation began to fray, not explode, decay. Like a slow unraveling no one could stop. Clarice Blaine, once the darling of lifestyle philanthropy, became the face of manufactured alliances. A major magazine withdrew her upcoming feature. Sponsors began auditing donations. Her social calendar evaporated. The women's initiative she once co-chaired quietly replaced her. Their official statement cited values misalignment. Behind closed doors, she scrambled to reassert control, calling in PR teams, lawyers, allies who once cheered at her garden luncheons. But silence answered her calls. Not out of cruelty, out of people remembered now. Reginald's fallout was quieter, but deeper. A pending board seat on a national finance committee was rescinded. A university postponed his honorary lecture. His name no longer opened every door, it required explanation. As for Jordan, he didn't disappear immediately. At first, he posted a carefully worded apology on social media, framing the prenup as a misunderstanding born of tradition. It didn't land. The comments flooded in. Tradition doesn't silence people. You watched her drown. This isn't about love, it's about control. Then came the leaks. From Lucy, the assistant no one noticed. She released the original marketing proposal, subject line, marital merger strategy Q4, and there I was on slide 3, not as a woman, as a demographic. The story hit national outlets within a day. The Times called, then NPR, then an old contact from law school, now anchoring a nightly segment on systemic power and consent. The family tried to deny, then to distract. It didn't work. Because the documents weren't opinions, they were facts. And facts, like seeds, bloom when planted in light. By week's end, Jordan deleted all his accounts. Word spread he'd gone to Europe to reset. But those of us who'd watched him freeze when it mattered knew the truth. He didn't leave to heal. He left because he couldn't stand to watch me rise. One evening, Miss handed me her phone. "You need to see this," she said. It was a post from a national women's advocacy account, a picture of my speech from the forum, captioned simply, "She didn't just walk away, she made sure no one else had to walk alone." That post had over 2 million likes. I sat with that for a long time, not because of fame, but because impact feels like air returning to lungs you didn't know were tight. The Blakes had tried to define me as a liability. Instead, I became a blueprint, not because I was brave, but because I was done asking for permission. And they were still asking the wrong questions. Not what did we lose, but how did we ever think she was disposable? 3 weeks later, Clarice attempted to host a closed-door charity gala. Less than 10 people showed up. Even the caterer arrived late. Photos of empty seats surfaced online, quickly becoming a meme. Legacy can't fill a room if no one respects the name. Reginald tried to pivot back into finance, proposing a new fund under a shell company. Investors backed out after vetting partners. Reputation, once intangible, now weighed like debt. As for Jordan, the whispers followed him. A quiet breakup in Europe, a leaked audio message lamenting she was always 5 moves ahead of me. And I was. Because while they scrambled to control perception, I built substance. The Marin Initiative's launch was covered by 3 major publications. We secured funding for projects focused on legal literacy for women in corporate mergers. A new fellowship named in my honor launched at my alma mater. Meanwhile, their names slowly vanished from press, boards, and invitations. Not erased, just skipped. That's the final cost of trying to script someone else's story. They stop reading yours and start writing their own. Months passed, the city changed its season, and I changed mine. The Marin Initiative grew not just in name, but in purpose. We hosted panels, funded startups led by underrepresented women, and created legal aid kits tailored for family contracts. For the first time, my work wasn't about proving my worth, it was about multiplying it. One morning, I walked into our office early. The sky outside was still the color of silver. On my desk sat a small package, wrapped in brown paper. No return address. Inside, a single notebook, blank, leather-bound, and a note, write what they never let you say. It wasn't signed, but I didn't need a name. I opened the notebook and wrote one sentence on the first page. I am not who they tried to make me. A few weeks later, I was invited to deliver the keynote at a global women's conference in Berlin. The hall was packed, cameras lined the back. I wore a crimson suit, the same color as the pen I used to sign my first contract on my own terms. My speech wasn't about scandal. It was about sovereignty. We spend years being asked to shrink, I told the room, to compromise, to yield, to make ourselves fit into templates we never designed. But here's the truth. They were never built for us. So we build new ones. Applause rose, not polite, but rising like tide. Afterwards, a young founder approached me, eyes shining. "You're why I applied for the initiative," she said. "You made me believe women like us could lead and not apologize for it." That night, I sat alone in my hotel room, overlooking the Berlin skyline. I sipped tea, no drama, no noise. Just peace. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one clutching a velvet envelope, wondering if silence was safer than defiance. She'd be proud. And more than that, she'd be free. Because the final twist wasn't revenge. It was reclamation, not of love, of self. The legacy I left behind wasn't Blaine's. It was my own, and it didn't need a surname, only a signature. Weeks later, the initiative's first annual report arrived. On its final page was a quote they'd chosen from my Berlin speech. "We don't have to rise quietly, we just have to rise." I read it aloud to myself and smiled, because the story wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to every woman who ever held her breath in a room that doubted her. And finally exhaled. Fully. A month after the Berlin keynote, I stood beneath a blooming magnolia tree in Charleston, far from the boardrooms, microphones, and echoes of the past. It was the dedication ceremony for the new legal education center under the Marin Initiative. Dozens of young women stood beside me, some first-generation scholars, others survivors of legal abuse cloaked in wedding vows. All of them carried fire in their voices. We planted a garden that morning, not for symbolism, but as a promise. We grow loudly, and we grow together. After the ceremony, I walked a winding path back to the guest house. At the gate, a small envelope waited for me. No seal this time, just my name. Inside, a letter from my grandmother Marin, written decades ago but never sent. Miss had discovered it in a forgotten file while scanning family documents. It read, "My dear girl, if you ever feel cornered, remember you come from women who made space where none was offered. You owe them nothing but your full self." I sat with that sentence for a long time, let it anchor me. In the weeks that followed, I made new decisions, not reactive ones, but deliberate. I signed off on a mentorship pipeline, approved a grant for single mothers pursuing law school, designed a toolkit called Sign on Your Own Terms. And every time a camera asked for comment, I made sure to say, "This isn't about me, it's about who comes next." One afternoon, I visited the Blaine estate, not to confront, but to close. It was listed for sale, the marble foyer cold and echoing. I stood at the doorway, left a copy of the initiative's first newsletter, and walked away. Not with triumph, with peace. Later that night, I journaled under soft, "We're never too much, you were just early." Then I signed it. Not Ilara Blaine, just Ilara. As 'cause I no longer needed their name. Mine was enough.